Welcome to the 2023 edition of the University of Utah Student Conference in Linguistics. This is always a highlight of our year because we get to see all the exciting work our students have been doing in a conference organized and run by these very same students. And this year, I've been especially impressed by the organizing committee. They've done a fantastic job, and I'm going to hand it over to them right now.
Okay, so thank you all for coming. We know it's early and it's a Friday, so we want to thank you for being here at all. And like Erin said, this is the 21st Annual University of Utah Student Conference in Linguistics. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that for those of us who are here in Salt Lake City today, we are joining from the unceded ancestral lands of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. While as linguists, we often examine language removed from its human context, it is our responsibility as researchers to consider the humans who use the phonological and syntactic processes that we study. Language cannot, and more importantly, should not, be fully divorced from the intersectional and multidimensional people who speak it. As you listen to today's discussions and engage with our presenters, I encourage you to engage critically with the privilege that allows us to examine language under the microscope, both as users and as researchers. To that end, we must recognize this nation's history of colonization and forced assimilation with regards to the indigenous languages and peoples as we share our research on this land. I would also like to give particular thanks to a few members of the faculty and staff here at our linguistics department, without whom this conference could not have been held. Erin Kaplan, Chantel, and Ezra have been foundational in organizing this conference. Furthermore, we would like to thank the organizing committee and volunteers, especially Abby Almas, Arina Grunch, Tanner Jones, Harrison Kale, Alamede Ogandare, and of course, my co-chair, Kelly Kendro. We are fortunate to have such a robust and supportive department.
And I just want to say Lex has done an amazing job. He really has taken the lead on so many things, even though, he's had so much on his plate. So really, if this is successful, please thank Lex. We're thrilled that so many students, especially at the undergraduate level and our first year cohort of graduate students, are involved in presenting at this conference. Beyond the students themselves, you'll notice that there are many collaborations across the department that are represented today. So collaboration is our greatest strength, and collaboration allows us to do the best science we can to consider our research questions from several different perspectives and really embrace the interdisciplinarity and multidimensionality of our field and the research questions we ask. And this conference really is a testament to everyone in the department and their commitment to good research practices and those collaborative practices. So before we let our session chairs start, we just want to go over a few things. Right after this, we're going to have lunch right upstairs in 2110. If you don't know where that is, just follow the mass of people. And then right after lunch, we're going to have in the same room our poster session. So please stick around for lunch, stick around for the poster session. And of course, session 2 with talks will be in this room. We are streaming to Zoom if you have other obligations, but would like to pop in. And we also ask that you respect our presenters. So if you have your phone, just make sure it's on silent. Please don't talk over them while they're presenting, and just generally refrain from anything disruptive during the oral presentations. And with that, I'm going to let our session chairs, Abby and Olamide, take it away and introduce our speakers.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. My name is Abby Almas. I'm one of the session chairs for this first session for today. We are going to have 3 talks this morning. The first one is going to be by Katrina Rost. It's going to be examining inner circle teacher beliefs on native-like and comprehensible speech in learners of English. Our second talk will be by Jacob Johnson, tool-assisted induction of MIT-ESL languages. Though I see that this is up here right now, so maybe that one is going first. And the third talk will be perceived credibility and eyewitness testimony by our wonderful Kelly Kendro. And yeah, I will invite Katrina to come up and give her talk now. Thank you.
Maybe.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. Okay, so I'm going to be presenting my master's thesis project, which was examining inner circle teacher beliefs on native-like and comprehensible speech in learners of English. So very quickly, there we go. Very quickly, I want to go over some key terminology. So when we're looking at the constructs accentedness, comprehensibility, and intelligibility, accentedness refers to listeners' perceptions around how accented a speaker's speech is. So that is how different it is from the local variety, however that's defined for the context. Comprehensibility is a listener's perception around how easy or difficult it is to understand someone's speech. And then finally, intelligibility is the degree to which listeners are actually able to understand someone's speech. So this is often assessed through transcriptions, for example. And then looking at world Englishes, Cockeroo in 1985 established the notion of world Englishes, which is different varieties of English throughout the world and their various approaches to them and treatments of them. So inner circle English is what's considered sort of the traditional basis of English, where it is the primary language. This includes countries like the US, the UK, Canada. Outer circle English is in the context of countries where English may be the lingua franca or even the designated language, but it may not be considered the so-called standard variety of English or is not recognized as native. And this includes countries such as Nigeria and India, among many others. And then finally, expanding circle, it includes countries where English is not the designated language, but it's becoming an important language for communication. So this includes countries, for example, like China and Russia, among many others. Okay, very quick overview of the literature. There's a wide array of studies examining accentedness, comprehensibility, and intelligibility. And the last few decades have witnessed a shift in the second language acquisition scholarship away from encouraging learners and teachers to emphasize native-like accent and accentedness as a goal and moving toward comprehensibility and intelligibility as goals. And so one question that arises is, as a result of all of the scholarship, how has this translated to the classroom? So there have been quite a few studies that have looked at this in an outer and expanding circle context. And they have found that while teachers tend to sort of uphold the native speaker model and consider native-like accent to be important for learners, they also find that comprehensibility is a very important goal as well. So one study by Sofakis and Sugari in 2005 asked teachers to respond to the question, do you think it is important for learners to acquire a native-like accent? And they found that 78% of teachers agreed that it was important, and 44% of them said it was either extremely important or very important for learners to strive for a native-like accent. And then other studies have largely replicated these findings and additionally found that teachers found comprehensible speech to be an important goal. Looking at an inner circle context, there are far fewer studies that have considered these questions from an inner circle context, but those that have revealed that there is a much greater preference for comprehensibility over a native-like accent as a speech goal. And so this study by Foote et al., which was conducted in Canada, found that 83% of teachers disagreed with the statement the goal of the pronunciation program should be to eliminate foreign accent as much as possible, whereas 89% of teachers agreed with the statement pronunciation should change to help make students comfortably intelligible to listeners. So one question is, why is there this difference in beliefs between inner circle contexts and outer and expanding circle contexts? And one reason may be the self-identified native or non-native speaking status of the teachers. So one study by Mind Nguyen in 2017 looked at a group of non-native speaking teachers and found that they tended to identify with what they termed the native speakerness ideology, meaning they're more likely to uphold native-like accent as an important goal in English language teaching. Okay, so some of the gaps in the literature, as I mentioned, there are far fewer studies that are looking at this from an inner circle teacher context. And then those that do don't tend to report the teacher's self-reported reasons for their beliefs around these constructs. And then finally, very few studies have examined whether the self-identified native speaker status impacts teachers' beliefs around native-like and comprehensible speech as goals for learners. So to sort of fill some of these gaps, my study looked at inner circle teacher beliefs around these constructs to see whether there was a preference for comprehensible speech over native-like speech for learners. And then I additionally asked teachers to report the reasons for their beliefs. And I looked at native speaking teachers versus non-native speaking teachers as independent variables. So my research questions include, do ESL teachers consider comprehensible speech to be more important than native-like speech as a goal for learners? Do self-identified native and non-native speaking ESL teachers differ in their beliefs around these constructs? And what are teachers' self-reported reasons for their beliefs? So I used convenient sampling to recruit 28 ESL teachers, all of whom were teachers in Salt Lake. 24 of the participants were self-identified native speakers, 4 were self-identified non-native speakers. And so I used self-identification of their native speaking status for a very important reason. So one study by Cheng et al. Sort of problematizes the use of these terms and recommends that we begin to move away from using them. But one of the things that they note is that studies often don't define how they're using these terms. So is it the speaker's proficiency level? Is it the order of acquisition? Or is it their identity around their native speaker status? So for mine, what I'm interested in is their own identity around their native or non-native speaking status as speakers of English. And I just sort of want to acknowledge the tension of, while we want to be moving away from these terms, there's also some relevant research around these different groups. And so how do we sort of deal with that tension, continuing to conduct research, for example, around the status of pedagogy, while having more sort of relevant and true terms that we can use. So my instrument was a survey that consisted of 12 statements, which were rated on a 5-point Likert scale, and they include statements such as, it is important for learners to acquire native-like accent. And then each statement was followed by a short answer prompt in which they were asked to explain their selection. And then I collected demographic information for reporting purposes. And the survey was administered remotely through Qualtrics. I'm going to see if I hit next here, if it's going to pop up with the, yes. So this is what it looks like for participants. And then at the end, participants received a $10 Amazon gift card as compensation. So in terms of the survey, all odd numbered items were indicating favorability towards native-like accent, and all even items were indicating favorability towards comprehensible speech. And then most of the items in the survey were paired, meaning that they were the same question, but for each construct. For example, item 1 is, it is important for learners of English to strive for a native-like accent, and item 2 is, it is important for learners of English to strive for comprehensible speech. For my first research question, I used a 2-sample t-test in R to determine significance between comprehensibility and accent items. For my second research question, it did not meet normality standards. The data was non-normally distributed. So I used a Mann-Whitney U test to determine significance between the groups. And then finally, for my third research question, I used qualitative analysis using NVivo. So NVivo is a software that allows you to do qualitative analysis, and it allows you to simultaneously code multiple, one strand of text to multiple codes, and it allows you to quantify the codes as well. And I used open coding, meaning that I derived the codes and themes from the data rather than using pre-established themes. Okay, so what I found was that participants overwhelmingly demonstrated a preference for comprehensible speech over native-like speech as a goal for listeners. And I found that this difference was significant between the items. I also found that for the paired items, comprehensibility was always agreed with to a higher extent. So between each paired item, there was no paired item, no situation in which the accent item was agreed with more than the comprehensibility item. I'll explain what I mean. So these are the median responses between across all the subjects for all of the items. And you can see that starting with the first one and skipping every other one, those are the accent items. And you can see that those are the items that tend to demonstrate more disagreements. And then starting with the second, you can see that every other one, these are the even items, and those are the ones that tend to demonstrate more agreements. So for the first pair, native-like accent was received a lot more variable responses. You can see that participants were pretty divided on this issue, whereas for the comprehensibility item, participants overwhelmingly indicated strongly agree. So for this question, participants tended to, can you guys read those from where you, okay, somewhat. So this item is saying that acquiring a native-like accent or comprehensible speech is possible for learners of English. Participants generally agreed for both, and you can see that all participants said that it was possible to acquire comprehensible speech. So most participants stated that it was more important to strive for comprehensible speech than native-like accent, which is what we would expect. And then, of course, for the opposite statement, we find that most people disagree. So in terms of whether this statement says learners need native-like accent in order to access professional opportunities, or comprehensible speech in order to access professional opportunities. Most participants disagreed with the statement for native-like accent, but they overwhelmingly agreed that you do need comprehensible speech in order to access professional opportunities. The next two items were not paired, but they provide some interesting information. So acquiring a native-like accent is important to help learners of English feel confident when they speak English. This item was very divided, and that was found in both the quantitative and qualitative results, that participants were really divided on whether they thought that this was helpful for increasing confidence or not. And then item 10 revealed sort of a surprising finding, which is that participants were very divided on this, whereas the literature sort of suggests that teachers may tend to believe that learners of English can maintain a connection to their culture by retaining an accent. Teachers were very divided on this issue, and in the qualitative data, they tended to have very strong opinions. So those that did agree tended to say, yes, this is extremely important for learners to be able to maintain a connection to their culture. And those that didn't agree tended to say this has no bearing whatsoever on whether you maintain a connection to your culture. And then finally, the last pair largely reflected the first pair, so they're quite similar. Participants tended to disagree that it was important to focus on attaining a native-like accent and agree that it was important to focus on attaining comprehensible speech. Okay, so for my second research question, looking at the two different groups, I did not find a significant difference between either the accent items or the comprehensibility items. So this may potentially be due to the fact that my study was not sufficiently powered, since I had 24 native speaking teachers and only 4 non-native speaking teachers. However, what I found was that through the quantitative and qualitative data, their beliefs were fairly similar. One interesting finding was that for all of the paired comprehensibility items, non-native speakers agreed with all of them. So you can see the paired items are items 10, 8, 6, 4, and 2. These are the comprehensibility items. For native speakers, there's a little bit of variability where they sometimes disagreed with them. You can see the non-native speakers agreed with every single one of them. Item 10 is not a paired item. So looking specifically at item 10, which is again, the item saying that learners can maintain a connection to their culture by retaining an accent. What I found interesting was that for native speakers, this was pretty varied. Mostly they agreed, but there's a little bit of variability in their responses. However, for the non-native speakers, they either indicated neutral or they disagreed. And I found this in the qualitative data as well. Most of them responded that they did not find it very important for learners to maintain an accent in order to maintain a connection to their culture. So I found that it was interesting that all of these comments that came out saying, yes, this is extremely important, all came from self-identified native speaking teachers. Okay, and then the qualitative data was very rich, but it generally revealed much subtler feelings about accent and comprehensibility than the quantitative data did. So some of the key themes that emerged from the data, one of the most cited theme was that being understood or being able to communicate was key. So teachers overwhelmingly stated this as a theme as being the most important thing for learners. But on the other hand, one theme that came up a lot was that native-like accent isn't the most important goal. So while in the quantitative data, they tended to say native-like accent is not important, in the qualitative data, they tended to say it's not important except for in these situations, or it's not as important as comprehensibility. So there was a little bit more of a gray area when you looked at the qualitative data. Again, this was the same for the statement acquiring a native-like accent is possible for learners. They tended to agree with the statement in the quantitative data, but then in the qualitative data, they tended to follow up saying it's possible for some, and a lot of teachers stated that they believed that it was possible for children to acquire native-like accents, but not for adults. Another theme that came up was teachers raised the question of if we're encouraging students to strive for a native-like accent, which native-like accent should we encourage them to strive toward? And several of them specifically reference world Englishes and English as an international language. And then several teachers also said that native-like accent may be helpful, but only if it's in service of comprehensible speech. And I found that they were divided in this, where some said, yes, it's helpful because it can help with comprehensible speech. And some said, no, these are two distinct constructs and they don't relate to each other. And then finally, one theme that came up a lot was a concern that listeners may be prejudiced towards learner speech. So as I stated, inner circle teachers overwhelmingly demonstrated a preference for comprehensible speech over native-like speech as a goal for learners. And because I did not find any difference between non-native and native speaking teachers, it may be that this difference in beliefs between inner circle and outer circle contexts may be more related to differences in English language teaching culture, for example, pronunciation training or other teacher training, hiring practices, learner goals, things like that. And then as I noted, qualitative data revealed much subtler themes than the quantitative data. And the theme, how can native-like accent be defined, raised a lot of interesting points with teachers specifically referencing English as an international language, arguing that we should move towards teaching learners how to interact with other non-native speakers rather than how to mold their speech to best be accepted by native speakers. And several reference English as an international language, which is which Jenkins in 2000, for example, wrote an entire book on how to teach certain sounds to learners of English in order to focus on intelligibility rather than native-like accent. And then several teachers spoke about learner goals and the reality of the biases learners may encounter, which raises an interesting point considering there have been quite a few studies that have looked at learner goals and have found that learners tend to state that they find native-like accent very important. When you ask learners, would you rather sound like a comprehensible speaker or a native-like speaker? Most learners tend to say native-like speaker. So how do we sort of deal with this tension between we don't want to encourage learners towards something that we maybe don't find valuable, but how do we also honor what the learner's goals are? And then finally, in terms of the role of the listener and speaker, what I found was that a lot of teachers raised this as an issue, but they were divided in terms of their treatment of it. So some said listeners may be biased towards these speakers, and that's a problem that we need to fix. And some said listeners may be biased towards speakers, and so they need to modify their speech in order to sound more comprehensible or more native-like. So in terms of limitations, I obviously had a very small number of participants and my groups were uneven. So future studies, it would be helpful if there were more participants to be able to better examine this. Additionally, as I mentioned, the term native speaker and non-native speaker is problematic. And so one way to potentially deal with that in the future is using it on a continuous variable rather than as a dichotomy. I was the only researcher conducting the coding. So the inter-rater reliability was, I wasn't able to verify that there was that. And then I also didn't have time to rate it twice. So I wasn't able to show intra-rater reliability either. And then finally, future research could potentially look at the effects of pronunciation training or other training on teachers' beliefs, because this may have quite an impact. And then finally, just a thank you to the participants who helped with this study and put in the time to completing the survey. And that's everything.
Thank you, Katrina. We will take this time to take questions for Katrina. So anyone have any questions? Lex.
Yes, so you did talk briefly about your data being non-normatively distributed and the test that you ran. I'm not particularly familiar with that test. Can you just go over that briefly for me?
Yeah, so I ran several normality tests. So I ran the Levine's test to check for homogeneity of variance. And this related mostly to the fact that I had 24 native speaking teachers and 4 non-native speaking teachers. So it made sense that the data wasn't normally distributed. And because the data was non-normal, I used the Mann-Whitney U test, which is very similar to a t-test, but is used for non-normally distributed data. It's a non-parametric test.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Zeta.
I kind of have 2 questions. I was curious about like the context of, like, would this be different in the context of like interpreter learning? like someone who's learning the language just to speak the language versus someone who's learning it to interpret, or someone who's learning it to teach it? Like, do you think that there would be anything different as if, like, you're asking these teachers, you know, what is the purpose of the person that's using this language?
Totally, and learner goals came up a lot. I also found that there was a lot of literature looking at what teachers believed, how teachers believed other teachers should speak, and especially in outer and expanding circle context, they tended to say that they needed native-like speech in order to be able to teach English, which is quite interesting. But yeah, I do think it depends a lot on learner goals, and there might be different results based on that.
Cool. Kelly?
So one of your questions, and I think a very good question, is do you think it's possible to acquire native-like speech? And I noticed that there were several people who disagreed with that. Did you happen to isolate their results to see if that might, if they might respond differently, or maybe less positively about the prospect of you know, comprehensible speech and native-like speech?
I didn't look at it in that way, but I did find that those who said that it was not possible oftentimes tended to, in their comments, then say it's just really, really difficult, or it's only going to happen in rare cases. And a lot of people cited the critical period hypothesis, saying very possible for children, but for adult learners, it's totally not possible. Which I found interesting that teachers tended to believe that.
Yeah, so to clarify, they weren't citing their own classroom experience, they were citing the critical period.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is a little bit tangential, but I had a student from West Africa last semester who was kind of extending some of the comprehensibility arguments to writing. And his argument was that his accent was part of his identity, and the same thing applied to his writing. And it bothered him that people were trying to get him to sound like a native speaker when he wrote.
Yeah.
I was wondering if he had a hard time finding any research about this. I'm wondering if you'd encountered any of something.
I didn't find anything around writing. I found that one of the studies looked at grammar in terms of these two constructs, but it wasn't specifically written. But I find that very interesting. I mean, it makes sense that this would apply to writing and speech. But no, I didn't find anything specifically like that.
Yes.
Kind of going off of that, I mean, if you were to look at grammar, do you think that the pattern between the native and the non-native participants would be similar in terms of like perfect grammar versus comprehensibility?
So if I'm understanding your question correctly, it is true that looking at, for example, accentiveness and comprehensibility, that relates to more than just phonological features. It relates to grammar variables as well. So it does have bearing on those two constructs, and I think it probably does have an impact on native versus non-native speech, but it depends. So that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
Any more questions? Yeah, Irina.
So the teachers in your study, I mean, were they the non-native ones, were they college degree teachers, or did they just have teaching certificates?
I have to double check. I didn't look specifically. Most teachers had quite a bit of experience. Most I think said that they were between either 1 to 5 years of teaching experience or 10 to 20 years. And from what I remember, the non-native speaking teachers had experience teaching both abroad and here, but it seemed like they had quite a bit of experience.
Thank you. And I have a second question. Was there a specific reason in choosing to look into teachers' opinions about this rather than testing whether comprehensible speech is actually possible in English?
So the reason I looked at teachers' beliefs was because I was mostly interested in seeing how these trends in the literature are reflected in the classroom. And just due to the scope of my study, I had to look at teachers' beliefs rather than looking at, for example, how these constructs actually applied in the classroom, doing a case study, for example. But I think it would be really interesting to do that in follow-up as well.
Yeah, say that.
I think you kind of covered, but I was curious about like what languages were the teachers like native in or teaching, I guess. Like what kind of, were they all sort of in the same group or was it all just like English? Or?
Yeah, so most teachers noted that they had other languages as well, that they were at least learning. It was pretty across the board, to be honest, and the non-native speaking teachers, I think, were pretty varied in their backgrounds as well. I believe one spoke Spanish, one spoke Korean, one spoke Chinese. I don't remember what the fourth one was, but yeah, it was pretty varied.
Any other questions? Yeah, Rachel.
You had a number of items where there was like a substantial number of people strongly agreeing and strongly disagreeing, which I think begs the question of like whether those individual teachers who were responding in these ways were responding kind of consistently across items such that you had like profiles of people, or if your individual items were actually like nuanced such that they were eliciting different kinds of responses. With respect to the teachers.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I didn't have time to create sort of profiles of the participants, but I think that would have been very interesting to look at to see whether they tended to indicate, for example, preferability towards comprehensibility throughout, or if it sort of depended on the question. I didn't get a chance with that.
Yes.
So again, about the teachers, on top of being native or non-native, did they all come from the same educational backgrounds? Like, were they only teachers in the USA or maybe in different countries?
They were teachers, they were at least teachers in an inner circle context. So basically, I asked them to describe their teaching background and made sure that all of them had experience teaching either in the US or in another inner circle context. But a lot of them had experience teaching abroad as well, especially the non-native speaking teachers.
Cool. And it doesn't look like we have time for any more questions, but thank you everyone so much. And thank you, Katrina. And next up, we have Jacob Johnson doing tool-assisted induction of MITSL languages.
Thank you. Hi, well, good morning, everyone. Like was introduced, I'm going to be talking about this tool-assisted induction of MITSL languages. And by the end of this, you'll understand what I mean by that. So the big idea is phonotactics, right? We've all seen this example, the Blick versus Bnick. And of course, as English speakers, we're generally going to say Blick might be an English word, it doesn't have a meaning associated with it, but Bnick does not sound like an English word. And of course, there's the big question of how did we learn this? And generally, how do we learn phonotactics? In this case, what we're going to look at is how can we teach just a machine, a computer program, to learn these same sort of phonotactics just from the good samples, the grammatical language samples. And we're going to use a transparent algorithm, meaning that we can understand why it makes the choices it makes. We can look at the results after the fact and understand, okay, it learned that because of this sample data. And we're also going to give this algorithm some explicit learning biases based on real world language phenomena. And I'll go into the detail on that now. So to introduce the rest of this topic, I'm going to explain what this MITSL language group means. the algorithm and how we implemented it, and then how we actually evaluated how well it learned these sort of phonotactic patterns. So before I can introduce the idea of MITSL, we're going to look at just formal language theory in general. And the idea with formal language theory is we're mathematically describing patterns of symbols that repeat. So if we're applying this to phonotactics, right, our sound instances or our segments are basically just patterns over a set of phonemes. And so as you know, you have the same phoneme occur in multiple words in a language, it looks like the sort of formal language idea where it's just a sequence or a string of these individual symbols. And there's a lot of variability. So basically, you don't have to remember this, but the big idea here is it goes here from most complicated over on this side to least complicated over on the right. And so the idea is the least complicated idea of how we could possibly learn this would be we just have a whole list of words that we just memorize. If it's a word, it's a word. If it's not on our list of words, it's not. This is computationally very, very simple. And it's obviously not the case because of the example with words like blick. That's not on our list of memorized words anywhere. And we still see it and saying, that sounds like it could be an English word. On the other side, we have something more complicated. There are further ones in like more computational context, but the idea of a regular language, there's certain repetitions allowed, and basically all chess games fall into this category. And so it's a more complicated category than recent studies and theories suggest we might need to capture phonotactic restraints. And so in particular, we're going to look at this category with the star above it, this MITSL, and I'm still building up to what those letters stand for. But the big idea is we have these different levels of complexity that can be used to mathematically characterize the sort of patterns that occur in natural language. And this has been used, for example, to investigate like the memory demands of cognitive processes in other contexts. So let's get into what this MITSL actually stands for and means by looking at some of the insights from real languages that build into it. So we've already seen the Bnick versus Blick, right? And of course, the idea there is there's two things that are local, that are adjacent to each other, that is violating some phonotactic rule. Another example from German is this word final devoicing, where we might treat the word boundary, here it's just like that little less than, we can treat that as a symbol in its own right. And we can say, for example, in the words like rad with the voiced d, that's invalid versus rat is valid. And so we see this all across these German examples. And of course, like we saw in English too, there's a lot of these examples where there's some, we call it local restraint, constraint rather, on two symbols that occur next to each other, or two phonemes. It's skipping some of my annotations, but that's okay. Another insight that we can get from natural language is this idea of tiers. So in this language, which is originally, it's from Southern California, it's now going under some like revitalization efforts. There are these words, and you can see the first two are grammatical, or rather ungrammatical, while the last one is acceptable, and so real word. And looking at the data, looking at the analysis, it has become like looking at more data, essentially. It has been found that the constraint that is being violated by these first two has to do with the fact that there's that s eventually followed by the sh sound, right? Or vice versa. Whereas in the third sample, it's it's good, it's grammatical because there's this harmony, this sibilant harmony. And so the explanation that we might say for this is that there's a tier which contains only these sibilant sounds, and that there's the same local dependency within just that tier. So the idea that you would take all the sounds that belong on that tier and analyze them together because they're now adjacent within that tier. And this matches the speaker intuitions, right? Our predictions are that the last one is good based on this approach, and that the first two are ungrammatical, and that matches, you know, with the asterisks. So this is a sibilant harmony. There's other phenomena like this, such as finished vowel harmony, but it's a very common pattern cross-linguistically. So this is the next insight that's going to build into this MITSL mathematical characterization. And there's the source for this data. And again, it's kind of skipped some of my animations, but that's okay. So for this language from Angola and the Congo, we have, again, some samples, one of which is ungrammatical, and two which are grammatical and furthermore have meanings. And if we just take the same approach as last time, we look at the data, see that it has something to do with these alveolar sounds, these and we just project them onto their own tier, and we make our predictions. Then we would predict the first row is what we would predict if we just naively pull those all onto the tier, right? Because we would say there's in the first one, there's a and a d, and so that must be ungrammatical. Second one has only that must be grammatical. The third one has d, and d, so it must be ungrammatical, right? If we go by the same process as last time, then that first row is what we would end up with, and it actually does not align with the speaker intuitions as indicated by like the ungrammatical asterisks. So basically based on the data, the approach to take is that we actually only want to project to the tier if they're not already immediately adjacent. So we see in this third example that and d are actually already in a context in the surface form of the word where they're adjacent. And so we have this, what we call input sensitivity, which tells us that we only want to project those samples from the tier if they're in particular contexts. In this case, the n and d being adjacent tells us it's not in a context where we need to project to a tier. So what this means in general is that not only based on the identity, like that actual current phoneme represented by that segment, do we decide to project to the tier, also based on the context it finds itself in. And we see if we do this, we end up with different tier projections. And now if we take the same hypothesis that there needs to be some sort of harmony on that tier, we end up with results that match the speaker intuitions. Right, yeah. my animations are playing a bit out of order. And of course, there's the data for that. And then lastly, another insight from languages is that there can be multiple of these restrictions all playing out at the same time, right? A language doesn't just have one phonotactic rule. And so all of those ideas put together build up the idea and the name of MITSL, and those are the learning biases that we're going to give to this algorithm. So it can have multiple of these rules. It is input sensitive, meaning based on the context, it decides to project to a tier. It is tier based, like sibilant harmony, where you have a certain tier of sounds you're looking at. and it is strictly local, like word final devoicing or the English restriction on bina. And so that builds up MITSL. Of course, the acronym itself is not so important, just the idea that there are these particular properties of the language class that are built into the learning biases and just the structure of this language class. And so we have this idea that, we as people who have heard a lot of English, who eventually learned to decide, we have all these words that we've heard that we know are good, right? We know are grammatical and follow all the English phonotactic rules. And we have these new forms that we might hear and might, make a judgment on whether they might be English or if they sound, like they don't even match English phonotactics. And so the question is, how can we do this? How can we, simulate this sort of process in a machine by giving it a lot of positive examples, saying these are words in the language, and then having it pass judgment on new words? And how can we train it to do that correctly? And so like a quick example of the idea behind this, if we have this made up language, right, we'll give it a lot of examples of words to say these are good, these are positive words. And then what it's going to do is to learn these phonotactic restrictions, as it will find substrings that don't occur in any of the words, right? So none of these words contain the substring EXXA, for instance. But what it will do is it will say, okay, do any of the words that I know contain parts of this substring? So for instance, we can see this word down here does contain EX, and then later it does contain XA. So that signals to the learner, okay, it's not ungrammatical for any word to ever have EX and then XA, for instance. There must be something special about this BB that occurs in the middle. And so basically it generates that there must be some sort of tier which contains EX and XA, and which basically prevents those from ever occurring adjacent to each other. It assumes some sort of local restriction preventing that from ever occurring. But they must have this BB, for instance, on that same tier, which says, okay, they're allowed to be on the same tier, just there's something intervening between them and causing this word to be allowed. And by repeating this for like all the substrings that it doesn't find, it can eventually build up a grammar representation. So for instance, if you remember, these were the samples from Samala. And of course, we would only give it positive examples. So we wouldn't give it, these ungrammatical forms. But if we gave it that one, the third one, and a bunch of more data, eventually it would come up with a tier that causes this restriction that looks something like this. It would say the tier consists of all and from within a word. And if we ever find something in this set of restrictions, like a or a on that tier projection, then we can reject that word because it violated one of the restrictions that we found. And so we implemented it as part of an existing project called SigmaPy. And the idea here is you can use it, you can create a custom language with these sorts of patterns built into it. You can pass it and it will build a representation of that grammar. And as you give it enough data, it will, if the pattern in your data can be characterized by this sort of learning biases, then it will eventually converge to that sort of grammar. And we evaluated it using the same evaluation pipeline from the project that we were building this on top of. And our process for that was we had, just like I described, we had some code that would generate samples from an artificial language. It would randomly generate 1,000 strings from that target grammar. It would pass it into the learning algorithm, which would produce a representation of that grammar. And then we would have that generate 1,000 more strings from whatever grammar it learned. And then we would evaluate, does this follow the original pattern that we passed in? Alternatively, we also used some simplified to basically, like I said, there's a lot of real natural language contains a lot of these patterns. And so we simplified it to sort of highlight the patterns that we wanted to test it on. But same thing, just pass that into the learner algorithm, generate 1,000 strings from the learned grammar and evaluate them. And these are the results in terms of how consistent the outputs were with the target grammar. And so you can see where we had some simplified German, simplified Finnish, simplified Turkish. And you can see that some of these patterns that we introduced at the beginning was exactly what we were trying to test, right? And you can see that it performed really well with even just such a small sample of about 1,000 strings. In most cases, it was completely consistent with the target grammar. In a few cases, it was just a very close approximation. And furthermore, as another, victory, because of the transparent nature of this algorithm, we were able to look directly at the grammar representation it learned and basically work backwards to figure out, oh, it only needed, in all three of these cases, it was about 20 more samples that we should have given it as example to learn on, and then it matched basically 100% consistency. And so, these are really exciting to see. And so in conclusion, we basically expanded an existing tool, the SigmaPy tool, just for experimenting with these sorts of language patterns. We've shown that we can program something that can learn and detect phonotactic patterns just from positive sample data. And one idea is that because it worked on such small amounts of data, it could potentially be useful for sort of low resource language to detect and to characterize these sort of patterns. And so, yeah, thank you for listening, and thanks to everyone who helped. And yeah.
Thank you, Jacob, for that wonderful presentation. Anybody has questions for Jacob? Okay.
I was curious because you kind of feel like the synthesized language and things like that. How did you did you have a specific way of choosing like what you're like I'm assuming you're doing this to kind of test it at first. But what had you words? So how did you decide like what parameters you were going to do with that? Like how many letters you were going to do and things like that, or was it just kind of?
Yeah, so because we basically were building on an existing project, these artificial generators and these evaluators we were able to reuse from an existing project. That project basically had done the same thing for one of those other language classes on the one with the big tree looking thing with all the, so we expanded that to this new.
Okay. So the language was based off specific rules, and then you did, okay. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. That's so cool.
Exactly. Yeah. Good question.
Any other question? All right.
Although covered with the thing, I know very little about formal language theory, but how would this handle instances of opacity?
Yeah. So basically, if you have something that's opaque to the restriction, right, then it would not learn, it would learn that thing that is opaque is not on that tier. So yeah, that's basically what it's going to do. It'll see that there's never a case where, that makes or breaks like that. If there's this thing, which never is like there's this substring and this substring that never occur together, and the opaque, I totally reverse that. Opaque means that it would block, right? Okay, so yeah, that means that it's like the BB example, where the BB is basically the opaque thing that prevents that from being ungrammatical. Sorry, the reverse in my head. Good question.
Any other question? Okay, nice.
And so when you were talking about your results and the accuracy of the predictions that the machine was making, I think I followed that. You were talking about comparing it to both artificial languages and simplified languages. What was the process with that, like both the simplifying languages that you were looking at, but also with the artificial languages?
Yeah, so with simplifying languages, it was basically something like, if it's Finnish and we're looking for vowel harmony, then we don't really care about like the consonants. So it'd just be like replacing all the consonants with just X or something like that. So that is just mainly just so that it can run faster is the idea. And to just say, we don't really care about this right now, so we'll just simplify that. So that was the process there. And then the process of like generating artificial language data. It's basically just you have, for instance, the idea of I want some sort of, say it was like a vowel harmony pattern, and the code, which again we took from that we expanded on that existing project, would basically just go through and it would generate, say, okay, here's our set of consonants, here's our set of vowels, here's our rules on the vowels, and it would just go through and generate a string and just check that it followed that. But the important distinction is that the generators, right, they were hard-coded to where, someone came up with it and just wrote it out and, bug tested it and whatever, so that it worked. Whereas the idea behind this is it's very flexible. It will adapt to your input. And the cool thing is that it can adapt to match this same thing as something that someone else cleverly came up with by hand. So yeah, if that answers your question.
Kelly, your question. What's next?
Yeah, so we're working on right now actually something. So this was a batch learner, right? And we're working on basically adapting this to an online learner so that it just takes one sample at a time. Yeah, that's what's next, basically.
I am curious, just from Lex's question, I'm getting that person. What is like the maximum that this thing can handle right now? Like, are there a certain amount of tiers that like once you put in like this language has this many tiers, it just is like, nope, that's enough, or it's like is there so much? Is there a reason that you did the simplified languages? You said it runs faster, but like,
correct.
Does it not run properly after a certain amount? And are you working to see why that is so?
Yeah, so basically, because it's looking for substrings that don't exist, like it doesn't find in its training data, right? Basically, the more number of individual characters you have, the more number of possible substrings you'll end up with. And so that's basically the largest limiting factors. If that gets too big, then it can get prohibitively slow. Good question.
Okay, quite Rachel.
So I'm glad you're on this slide because I wanted to ask about the informativeness of the 1,000 strings it gets. I think you're saying that it's the strings it gets are exhaustive of the possible combinations such that it knows that EXXA is not possible, rather than like, is EXXA like blip? Could it be a blip type?
So EXXA in this case is just like a particular substring that doesn't exist. What you asked is 1,000 an exhaustive sample, and that is a very important distinction. No, it is not, because, and that's exactly why we end up on here not getting 100%. But the cool thing is that in the space of how many strings we could possibly have given it, that we only had to give it 1,000 random ones, and that even though there's no proof that it will converge like this, the fact that it does is pretty cool.
Okay.
So yeah, so that's to answer whether it's exhaustive. And then is EXXA like a BLIC? Not quite. The EXXA is more in the process of it thinking, I've never actually heard bowl or button before, right? And so this is to demonstrate the process of it learning on its batch of words, whereas in this case we didn't actually test. Here's here's Banik, is that good? We tested when you generate new strings, are they consistent?
With those new strings, so could something that doesn't appear be possibly well formed? Like, does it know that EXXA is bad?
So I'll answer, could it potentially repeat the first thing you said? Sorry.
So EXXA is an example of something that didn't appear in its input, right?
Correct.
Okay. And so it's good at generating like possible forms that just don't happen to be in the input. Does it know that those forms are bad, or does it just know that those forms are not frequent?
Yeah, it just knows that they're unattested. So the EXXA is unattested. So yeah, so that is why it says consistency up there. Because in like formal language theory, there's also completeness, which is the idea, could these generate every possible word that is within the target language? And in this case, we didn't actually test that. And that has to do with the way that the grammar is constructed, where actually cuts. But yeah, good question.
Okay, yeah, that's fine.
So I'm curious, with the model you've got here, would it be able to take into account morphophonologies? So in Hungarian, for example, rounded harmony only exists on certain suffixes and not others, whereas the front and back harmony is more consistently across morphemes.
I would say no, it doesn't have like an explicit notion of morphology. So unless if there was like some phonologically visible like morpheme boundary, then correct, yeah, it would not be able to pick up that just from the phonology.
Jacob, thank you. That's all the question we can take for this session.
Thank you.
So the last presentation for this session is by Kelly Kendrew. She'll be talking on perceived credibility in eyewitness testimony.
Making sure you don't have to do presentation.
Shoot, I'm somebody doing it, but is there
Oh, perfect. And I just tap.
Yeah, so if you click right here.
Hey everyone, so today I'm going to talk about some of the findings from my MA thesis, which is looking at what might influence perceived credibility and related metrics in eyewitness testimony. So first, I'm not going to call you out, you don't have to raise your hands, but just think about how you think someone's lying to you, how you know someone's lying to you. So do you look at things like body language? Are you listening to the words they're saying and trying to find inconsistencies? Is it suspicious if they talk too much? Is it suspicious if they don't talk too much? What sorts of things go into your perceptions of veracity and credibility? So today I'm just going to talk about background of perceived credibility and also lexical diversity, which is what we're using as potential predictors of perceived credibility. And then I'll go into my study, what we did, and what we found. So first, we're going to talk about juror perceptions of eyewitness testimony. So in the Sixth Amendment in the Bill of Rights from the very beginning in America, we've had this right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury. And historically, this has been very broadly construed with who's allowed to be on a jury, where the jury pool is coming from. So we have a lot of work to do, not just with who's on the jury, but also their possible partiality or biases. So today we're going to talk about linguistic injustice in eyewitness testimony assessment, focusing particularly on who is using language and what kind of language they're using, and also just more broadly, how their differences in language use can result in measurably different outcomes in the courtroom. So who is using language? There's been some previous work specifically on eyewitness testimony, looking at these kind of subjective dimensions of identity. So perceptions of race and perceptions of accentedness. Katrina gave a really, really nice nuanced perspective of accentedness earlier. And I just want to reiterate that, everyone has an accent. And when we talk about accentedness, these are subjective perceptions that are typically reflecting, does someone talk like me or do they not talk like me? So Laura Frumkin has done some work on this. She found that accent status and perceived ethnic origin significantly predicted perceived accuracy, credibility, deceptiveness, prestige, and perceived guilt. She looked at German speakers, Mexican speakers, and Lebanese speakers. There was a visual component and it was their spoken production. She had two conditions within each set of speakers, people who had an accent and people who were perceived as not having that accent. And she found that there were no real differences for these dimensions between the German and the Mexican speakers, but they were both they were both perceived as significantly more credible than the Lebanese speakers, getting into sort of this perceived ethnic origin question, but accent status for all of these speakers did significantly predict these dimensions. And then in a partial replication several years later, with only audio, so no visual component, there were significant effects of perceived race in those audio clips. So white speakers were considered to be more credible than Black speakers. Social status, so higher status speech was seen as more credible than lower status, and then age, where speakers perceived to be younger were rated as more credible than people who were perceived to be older. And when we're looking at the specific language they're using, we know that are all these biases and again, very subjective measures when we talk about language and language variety. So we know that African American English is very stigmatized as a minoritized dialect. Rickford and King had a really nice, thorough assessment of the George Zimmerman trial. So George Zimmerman is a man who followed and killed an unarmed 17-year-old who was Black named Trayvon Martin. And Rachel Jeantel was his friend who was on the phone with him when he was being followed and then ultimately killed. And in that trial, Rachel Jeantel was the main witness for the prosecution, but she was using African American English because she's Black and that's the way she talks. That is her, default. That is how she communicates. And we know that her race and we know that her use of language were reasons that the jurors found her testimony inaccurate and not credible because they told people this. So George Zimmerman was not convicted. And after, they went outside and talked to the press and said, yeah, she was talking in a different way. So we didn't think she was credible. The way she was acting didn't seem like she was giving us an accurate view of what happened. Similarly, we know that L2 production, so someone who learns a language later in life, can affect perceptions of veracity and credibility. There's a paper by Ehrlich this year that looked at an L2 English speaker's I don't want. This woman was sexually assaulted, and during her attack, she kept saying, I don't want. She was Chinese, had moved to an English dominant area, and was communicating in her second language of English. And the jurors said, I don't want means she didn't want to have a relationship with the man who attacked her. And he was acquitted on all charges. And again, her I don't want was cited as the reason they didn't think he was guilty. And I know we're going to talk more, well, there's some great posters coming up about accented speech. So just generally, we know that perceived accent in speech is perceived to have lower veracity. Now we're going to talk a little bit about lexical diversity and vividness and define those terms. So what is lexical diversity? We're very lucky to have Scott Jarvis here, who is also my committee chair and my advisor, because he's really done a lot of work on lexical diversity, and he's really one of the leading experts. Generally, we define lexical diversity as measurements of unique lexemes in a text and variations upon that measure. And historically, we see that higher lexical diversity scores are generally showing that a text is more lexically diverse, whereas lower scores are indicating more repetition. So there are 7 dimensions that Dr. Jarvis has identified of lexical diversity. The first 3 are the most basic: abundance, volume, and variety. Abundance is types, so the dictionary form of a word. So go and went would be the same type. Volume is tokens, which is just a raw word count. And then variety, repetition, is type token ratio at a very basic level. And then there are several variations upon that. So to give you an idea of types versus tokens, this is on our department website. It's telling us about the department. It's great. It tells us a lot. But when we look at the actual words, we see that many of them are repeated. It doesn't make it sound bad. And in fact, we should be repeating things like language and linguistics to describe a linguistics department. But those repetitions give us 57 types compared to 88 tokens and a type token ratio of 0.6477. And in our study, we use 3 measures of variety repetition: HDD, MATTR, and MPLDW, that assess this in different ways. The other 3 standardized dimensions are evenness, disparity, and dispersion. So evenness is just the balance of these different types throughout the text. Disparity is the degree of semantic interrelatedness among words in the text. So, are they synonyms or are they unrelated? And then dispersion is the distance between tokens that have the same type within that text. And then we've got specialness. So specialness is broadly defined as the words that can lead to perceptions of higher lexical diversity, but there's really no standardized way to assess this. So this needs to be calibrated for individual texts to find the specific reference corpus that is appropriate. So we didn't look at specialness for this study. We could in the future, but we decided to stick with the more standardized and more widely used metrics. In terms of what we do with lexical diversity, it's typically used in practice for assessing language proficiency. So higher language proficiency is generally linked with higher lexical diversity. In HCD, one of those measures we're going to use, a variety repetition, is strongly and significantly associated with proficiency in writing in particular, which is important for our current study. And then interestingly, we see that there's kind of a bell curve when we talk about lexical specificity. So if you're using a really specific way to describe something versus a vaguer term, that are associated with both lower and higher proficiency levels. So if you're less proficient, maybe you don't have that high vocabulary, so it's a little lower. When you have that moderate proficiency, you're able to use those more specific words. And then as your proficiency increases, you no longer use those specific words as much. And now I'm going to talk about vividness. What is vividness? Which is a great question because we don't really have a solid definition of it. Vividness is this concept that emerged in social psychology in the 1980s. They apparently didn't know about lexical diversity because there is very, very little work on vividness and lexical diversity as being related. It's never satisfactorily been quantified. So I'm going to show you an example of what's considered a vivid text versus a pallid text. But the results from studies that are incorporating vividness show that these minute differences in descriptions can lead to radically different outcomes in court cases and assessment. So a palette description in testimony would be, on his way out the door, the defendant staggered against a serving table, knocking a bowl to the floor. Whereas the vivid description gives a lot more context. On his way out the door, the defendant staggered against a serving table, knocking a bowl of guacamole dipped to the floor and splattering guacamole on the white shag carpet. So with that second example, you can kind of see that in your mind. You can see sort of the implications of knocking against the serving table. And in this study and follow-ups, vividness has been linked to recall. So if you're tested 2 days later and asked what the testimony was about, you can recall the vivid description better than the non-vivid description. It's associated with more persuasiveness. So whether it's someone on the prosecution side who's using a vivid description or someone on the defense side, whoever's using the more vivid description is seen as more persuasive by jurors and mock jurors. And it results in higher perceived guilt. So if you're vividly describing some crime that was committed, the person you're describing as committed the crime will likely be associated with being more guilty. And the thinking behind this is that vivid accounts might inspire stronger emotional reactions, which are more memorable and easier to recall. So we're going to move on to the current study. I have 2 research questions. The first is, how are diverse credibility metrics? We used 5 that are primarily taken from that Frumkin 2007 study: perceived accuracy, perceived deceptiveness, perceived credibility, perceived eloquence, and perceived prestige. And then our differences in credibility ratings of written eyewitness statements associated with measures of lexical diversity. And we're predicting that the credibility metrics were going to be very highly correlated and very highly associated with one another. And we also predicted that higher lexical diversity was going to lead to stronger perceptions of credibility. For our participants, we had 64 in total. We recruited them from Prolific. We had 16 conditions, so there were 4 participants in each condition. We had several parameters on Prolific. We wanted them to identify as American for their nationality. We wanted to make sure they spoke English because we were going to show them some English. They were all 18 and older, and they had answered questions related to their jury service, crimes, things like that. Our final sample was aged 19 to 79. We had 23 male, 39 female, and 2 non-binary participants. 62 of the 64 were born in the US, 2 born abroad, and 6 of them had served on a jury, while nearly half had been called to serve on a jury, but either were not selected or were not eligible. So we collected all of our data via Qualtrics survey. We consented them first, then we gave them a demographic questionnaire. After the demographic questionnaire, we double checked with them just to say, we're going to ask you to read some descriptions, and if you don't feel comfortable with this, you can leave. None of them decided to leave. We swore them in with a juror's oath saying, do you promise to take this seriously, and do you promise to answer honestly? Then they evaluated the 4 texts they saw. Then we released them, thank you for your service to the court. And then we debriefed them. So we told all of them that the passages that they were reading were from actual court cases. They were not. They were written statements that were generated for another study, and I'm going to talk about that next. And that's why we needed the debriefing, as it was considered deception by the IRB. So each participant saw 4 of 8 total written statements, and then they ranked them on a Likert scale from 0 to 10. With things like, how accurate do you think the person who wrote this is? How credible do you think the person who wrote this is? How much do you think the person who wrote this is trying to deceive you, etc.? And those are questions, and their framing were taken directly from Frumkin 2007. In terms of the stimuli, the 8 passages range from 100 to 179 words. They were generated by a different study that we conducted, and check out Abby's poster in the poster session to hear more about that. The videos that the participants in the other study were shown were of some sudden event. So someone stole a purse, there was a car accident, someone almost gets hit by a car, a tree falls. And we only changed the statements that were generated there from 3rd person to 1st person. So instead of the driver was on the road and then the boulder came. I was driving on the road and then the boulder came. We looked for the most lexically diverse of the texts that we had generated and chose those. So each of the 8 passages described a different video. 4 of the passages we chose were from L1 English users and 4 were from L2 English users. Like I said, we had 16 conditions, and then these texts were evaluated for lexical diversity as well as vividness. Because there's no tried and true way to assess vividness, we quantified it in our study as the proportion of adjectives, adverbs, and prepositions and conjunctions over total words. So anything that is adding more description to a sentence. For our analyses, we plan to run Pearson's correlations for credibility metrics, and then principal component analysis to determine if any of the metrics were so highly associated with each other that they should be collapsed for analysis purposes. Then we ran multiple linear regression models with the lexical diversity metrics and vividness as predictors of whatever those collapsed credibility metrics would be. We had 3 measures of variety repetition, as I had said, so we ran different models with each of those because we expected them to be so highly correlated that it wouldn't make sense to have all 3 in the same model. And then as exploratory post-hoc analyses, we wanted to look at the association between metrics of lexical diversity and that construct of vividness. So what did we find? We're still working on interpreting the results. So these are kind of the broad preliminary findings. In terms of how diverse credibility metrics are related, we see that accuracy and credibility are very highly correlated and significantly so. Not as highly correlated with deception, eloquence, or prestige. We see that deception isn't necessarily as highly correlated with things and has some non-significant correlations. And then we see that eloquence and prestige are more highly correlated. And so from our principal component analysis, we found 2 principal components with eigenvalues of 1 or higher. And we see that we have these really clean dimensions of deceptiveness kind of doing its own thing, and then accuracy and credibility being very similar, and prestige and eloquence being very similar. So we did collapse accuracy, credibility, and prestige and eloquence for 3 total metrics. Our second question asks, are differences in credibility ratings associated with measures of lexical diversity? I want to be very clear, these are the results of regression analyses. So when we were looking at raw correlations, sometimes they showed different things, but when the regression analysis was controlling for all of the other variables, all the other aspects of lexical diversity for these results, we found these findings. So we found that type was significantly and negatively associated with accuracy and credibility, or perceptions of accuracy and credibility rather, and perceptions of eloquence and prestige, as was evenness, again, significantly and negatively associated with those elements. Whereas tokens were positively and significantly associated with accuracy and credibility ratings and eloquence and prestige ratings, as were all of our measures of variety repetition. And then we didn't get significant results for disparity and dispersion as predictors of combined accuracy and credibility in every model. And for combined eloquence and prestige, disparity was negatively and significantly associated with those ratings. And then vividness, it definitely seemed to significantly predict something, but depending on the variety repetition variable, it changed the direction. So we have lots of questions about what's going on with those variety repetition measures and how they might be measuring that element of lexical diversity differently. And then for our exploratory analyses, looking at vividness and lexical diversity, we see that vividness is significantly correlated with all of our metrics of lexical diversity, but the strongest correlation is 0.537, which is not very strong. But it does seem to have some place with the other lexical diversity metrics, and it is predictive of outcomes for our credibility metrics. And so we're tentatively saying that we think vividness might be an additional dimension of lexical diversity, or at least it's measuring something that these other metrics just aren't. So the major takeaways were that accuracy and credibility are highly correlated with each other, as are eloquence and prestige, but deceptiveness was not correlated strongly with any of the other metrics. Vividness and certain dimensions of lexical diversity are associated with scores and ratings for perceived accuracy and credibility and perceived eloquence and prestige, but there were no significant predictors of perceived deceptiveness, which means that, again, that's weird. And there's something going on where everyone else is relying on other things to determine if someone's being deceptive. And importantly, all of these dimensions of lexical diversity and their influences with regards to these perceptions might disadvantage L2 users. So if types are negatively associated with, if tokens are positively associated, that means that longer texts are often going to be rated more credible, more accurate. And if L2 users produce shorter text, that would disadvantage them. With the bell curve, we were talking about if we have someone who's producing more types, that might be, again, rated more negatively because of our associations between types and being negatively associated with accuracy, credibility, eloquence, and prestige. And then vividness generally may represent this previously unidentified dimension of lexical diversity, and we're going to dig into that a little more, but this is what we've got for today. So here are my references, and just thank you to everyone. Thank you to my committee, Scott, Rachel, and Beth Hepford, who's not in Utah with us, as well as just every single person in the department who has helped me get through this year, because it has been a doozy, and I'm really, really grateful for everything.
Thank you so much, Kelly, for this amazing presentation. And does anyone have any questions for? Yeah, Zeta.
I was curious because you said that you kind of had to come up with a way to measure the vividness. Like, I was just curious about like how you split it up. Like, did you do prepositional phrases, or was it just like the preposition itself? Like did you measure it in chunks, or was it the words?
So we use something called tree tagger, which goes through a text and then tags it for part of speech. And they're very detailed parts of speech. So for instance, comparative and superlative words are differently, defined. And so with that, we looked through everything and we said, okay, any sort of adjective, any sort of adverb, the preposition itself, because we couldn't, because it was a word by word basis, it wasn't phrasal, we couldn't say, oh, this noun belongs to this preposition. So yeah, does that answer your question?
Well, then I did have a question about, because you did bring it up about the L2 undershooters like having different, I guess, flavors of speech. Like I was wondering if you had got to account for that, or did account for that, or like separating the participants of like how they perceive language. Like a neurodivergent might perceive the language before explanation is more truthful because it's being, like I was curious if you thought about, like kind of categorizing or finding that.
Well, we didn't collect data specifically related to things like neurodivergence from our participants. We tried to keep the demographic questions brief and either directly related to experience with the criminal justice system or questions to make sure that we were, trying to represent the US generally and have this be more broadly applicable as results. In terms of perceptions, we did collect qualitative data. We said at the end, who do you think this person is? Who do you think wrote this? What are their demographics? And so we have that as qualitative measures. It's a lot to dig into. So we're still working on that, but it was really interesting. So sometimes the shortest answer was dumb. They just said dumb. There were other just interesting responses where they said, I think this is, I think this writer is Mexican. I think he works in a neighborhood that he doesn't live in, probably late 20s, maybe has a beard, lower socioeconomic status. So we've gotten some really interesting results there too. Again, it's going to take a bit to go through those and figure out how those perceptions and specifically the demographic variables that they named might be linked to these outcomes. But we weren't finding that, for example, that the amount that they wrote was strongly correlated with their perceptions.
This is great. I have two small questions on these metrics related things. So one is, so you have your measures of variability based on number of different types and then potent types. Do you have a measure of independent frequency of the types? Like I could imagine somebody who uses less types, but they are highly registered ones, but they are less frequent enough types for wrong. And I will be.
So you're talking specifically about how this production might be linked to corpus, so some reference corpus?
Yeah, right. Like, so these are all sample dependent.
Right, yes. And so if we had looked at specialness, we would have had to find a reference corpus because, for instance, I know Mary did a project on TV genres, which might have very different expected words than, say, descriptions of a car accident. And specialness, just because it is calibrated and in tune with each specific sample, we figured that wasn't as replicable, as standardized, and we wanted to keep to those more standardized metrics.
My other question is more of a probing question. So I think your vividness results are very interesting, right? And you're characterizing them in terms of lexical, but you're measuring things that suggest syntactic complexity, right? An additional number of adjectives or adverbs of the positions in a corpus for me suggests a higher degree of phrasal complexity. And so I think the numerical results is pretty interesting, but I would like you to tell me more about you think that's the indication of lexical specificity and not that maybe capturing aspects of linguistic structure that your other metrics are not capturing.
So it definitely could be related to lexical complexity. It's not an analysis we've run, but we definitely can and probably should be running that. When we look back on how vividness has sort of been operationalized in the past, many of the words are the same, and they're just adding additional descriptions. And yes, it is more syntactically complex, but the syntactic complexity is specifically to give more detail.
Well, but that's not to be syntactical and the way it is
right.
Right? I mean, I'm not objecting to,
right.
Thinking about.
Yeah. So I definitely think they probably will be very highly related. But in terms of trying to have a quantitative description of vividness and be able to compute that and have it more standardized, I'm very open to suggestions and constructive. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Push the future question of the interpretation of the metric.
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, I think we will look at that as well. As well as just seeing, would these, if we can get our hands on some of the data from other studies that have operationalized vividness, if we can find the same results using this sort of metric.
It's super interesting.
Thanks.
All right, and I think that's all the time we have for questions. But if you would all like to join us afterwards for lunch right now, I think it's up in 2110, I believe. You can just follow the massive horde of people that's going towards the food. Shouldn't be too much of an issue. But thank you to all of our presenters and thank you to our audience as well. Our presentation is titled
relating perceptual sensitivity to word learning performance. In English, specifically, it's about English users learning the Hindi dental retroflex contrast. This is the button.
Yeah, this is where you got it. Use the one on the screen. Down there.
Okay, hold on. All right. So a little background. Adult language learners obviously must encode and use lexical representations that distinguish novel phonological contrasts, so contrasts that are new to them. Literature has also shown that English speakers' pre-existing perceptual sensitivity to Mandarin lexical tone contrast is associated with the ability to distinguish newly learned minimal pairs of words. Also, pre-existing sensitivity has been shown to predict whether learners benefit more from single or multiple talker training. So a little more background, we have these two studies have shown these certain things about lexical tone contrasts. So like I said, subjects with higher pre-existing perceptual sensitivity outperform those with lower pre-existing sensitivity. And also multi-talker training is better than single talker training for higher pre-existing sensitivity subjects. And it's the opposite pattern for those with lower sensitivity. And that's been studied with tone contrast, but the purpose of our study is to see if that extends to segmental contrast. So our research question is, does the relationship between pre-existing sensitivity and phonolexical learning observed for suprasegmental tone contrast extend to novel segmental contrast? So we have, our experiment was connected into separate study sessions. We had study session 1, perceptual sensitivity experiment. So this is with the research question, do individuals actually vary in their pre-existing sensitivity to L2 segmental contrast? So in this case, specifically, English speakers and Hindi dental retroflex contrast. And our second session was the word learning experiment asking, does pre-existing perceptual sensitivity to this Hindi dental retroflex contrast predict word form learning?
So yeah, like was just introduced, the first task has to do with the perceptual sensitivity. So can participants distinguish between these sounds? And the study looked like this. They had the consent, the sound check, and then they went into an AXB discrimination task between different Hindi sounds. Additionally, there was a perceptual assimilation task, which is not reported here because that kind of goes down a different line, as well as a sound blending task, which also kind of was to test like a similar research question, which was part of the same experiment, but it isn't, we're not going to go into it here. And then at the end, a background questionnaire. And so we had 326 total participants for the study. However, due to a lot of exclusionary criteria, including knowledge of a language with these aspiration contrasts, like we're testing for in Hindi, or allophonic retroflex consonants, as you can see occur in many, many languages. We had to exclude 152 of those participants, which left us with 174. And so their actual task involved these materials. So there were 4 tokens each of 8 particular phonemes, and they were paired off. Each of the 8 was paired into a dental and a retroflex version at, for voiced, voiceless, and for aspirated or unaspirated for all of these contrasts. And we had 4 Hindi talkers, which each recorded these 4 tokens, like 4 tokens each. And so the procedure, of course, is that they would hear each of these tokens once as the X, and 64 times it was the A, 64 times it was the B. And for each of these contrasts, they had 32 total trials. They were blocked by talker, but those talker blocks and the items within those blocks were random. And basically they just saw something like this. If the second word, it's an ABX. So if the second sounds like the first word, press 1 button. If the second word sounds like the third word, or rather it's an AXB. So if the X sounds more like the B, then I would press a separate button. And so our finding is that the listeners did exhibit variability and pre-existing sensitivity to these contrasts. As you can see over here, it ranges from around 25 all the way up to 75%. And so of course, those are separated on this slide by the different contrasts. That's what those 4 are. But additionally, we saw that even within talkers or and across talkers, right? So in this case, each of the 4 big blocks is one talker, and we can see within talkers, there's variability, and across talkers, there's variability. So like T3 there, for the second contrast, it was a lot more discriminable than some of the other ones. And so this basically answers, yes, English speakers do vary in their pre-existing sensitivity. So yeah, that was the findings of the first study.
Which brings us to the second experiment, our word learning experiment. The data for this experiment was collected fall of 22, and it was a returning group of participants who had already completed the study session 1 that Jacob just talked about. The experiment flow was a consent, a sound check, a word learning task, which took about 20 minutes. And we're going to go through each of the components of that task in a moment, and then followed by a participant background questionnaire. So like I just mentioned, the participants of this study must have completed experiment 1, the perceptual sensitivity experiment. And all the participants were randomly assigned to an experiment involving one of the 4 contrasts. We had 72 participants originally, but after our exclusionary criteria, we had 34 participants. Our stimuli consisted of 40 word types using these dental retroflex contrasts by 5 word contexts, and that will make also a bit more sense in just a moment. 3 tokens of each were used in the word learning / exposure phases and also the criterion test. And then there was 1 token used for the final test that participants had not heard yet during the first 2 phases of the experiment. And all of our tokens were produced by a single talker, referred to as Hindi Talker 5. Okay, so this is the first phase of the experiment, an exposure phase 1. We had 10 words by 8 repetitions each, and participants were just asked to listen to the words and memorize them. So on their screen, they would see 1 picture at a time, and they would hear the word corresponding to that picture. If we wanted to hear some examples.
Ila. Tusa. Tema.
I can't reach the 4th one, but I guess I could just.
Ila.
There you go.
Okay, sorry.
Then that was followed by criterion test 1. And this consisted of 20 trials. 10 of them were matches and 10 of them were mismatches. And importantly, the criterion test did not contain testing on minimal pairs. And on their screen, participants again saw an image and heard a word, and they were asked to indicate on their keyboard whether the word matched the picture or not. So again, some examples.
Ila. Tusa.
So that would be a match and a mismatch respectively. This was followed by a second exposure phase set up exactly like the first. Again, participants were asked to listen and memorize the words. And these are the same exact ones. If we want to hear them again, we can, but we don't have to. Then this was followed again by a criterion test set up exactly like criterion test 1. Again, no minimal pairs were tested. And these are also the same for just the sake of the example. And the final component of the experiment was a test set up like the criterion tests. However, this did include minimal pairs, and this was the first time participants were tested on minimal pairs. If we want to play these.
Lila. Lila. Lila.
So as you can see, that second couch would have been a mismatch, but that was the minimal pair to the first utterance. So yes. Okay, then this is just another summary of it. Okay, so for criterion test 1, and on this graph, each dot is the mean accuracy of one participant. So if that makes a little bit more sense, participants appear to be learning the words. However, remembering that they were not tested on minimal pairs yet, which is telling us that almost everyone is above chance. So it means they are learning, but it means they're learning the global forms of the words, which are the non-minimal pairs. So just keep in mind that. And then here is criterion test 2, again, for each of the 4 contrasts. Even more reliable word learning than criterion test 1. And then we get to the final test, and almost all of the participants are right around chance, which means that this was, again, the first time that they were tested on the minimal pairs of the contrast, which might tell us that that they weren't picking up on the contrast during the first 2 exposure phases and criterion tests.
Excuse me. All right. So this is sort of what we were expecting to see. We wanted to see word learning accuracy increase as their success on the sensitivity task increased. So this is when we were combining the first session that we talked about and the second session. So we're hoping to see something like this. And we saw this. So unfortunately, there's a very slight incline, but it wasn't enough to be significant or to make any conclusions about whether these 2 things were relating in our study. So clearly something isn't quite working here. We don't see sufficient word learning achievement when using the novel contrast that we're interested in. So now we need to come up with a way to do word learning that lets participants actually learn these new dental retroflex contrasts. So we just brainstormed a bunch of ways to make word learning hopefully easier for participants, like more direct input of difference between minimal pairs. So adding minimal pairs to criterion tests, and this specific idea has been implemented and we're collecting data already. We also came up with the idea to give feedback to participants. That's also implemented, but we're not collecting data on it yet. Some other ideas that we came up with were to present the contrast with fewer word contexts. So like only Ila and Uuscil, or to train on minimal pairs as 2 separate words with other contrasts. Move that again. We also considered doing more word learning phases or explicitly telling participants about the contrast. We also considered changing the structure of the word learning parts, like grouping the words during learning in groups of 3. So this is what we are already implementing. So we have 2 repetitions of the exposure phase again, and we have the criterion test. So the only difference here is that we're including minimal pairs on this criterion test. And so some examples. Exposure phase, that's the correct answer. And then this is the minimal pair. So that would be a mismatch, I believe. And then the final test is another, oh, hold on. There. So we've implemented this and it's collecting data. So hopefully we see better word learning from this. We're also designed how to do it with feedback. So the additional change for this idea for option 1B is to have the experiment actually tell participants whether they were correct or not. So we have in the criterion test, we have the minimal pairs, and we also have like them being told that they're incorrect, like if they answer wrong in one of the minimal pairs. So hopefully it'll sort of clue them into that there's something else going on, that there's actually a contrast there. So yeah, our future directions. Well, no, it's not any better. We want to eventually do a multi-talker word learning experiment. So this is related to one of the studies that we talked about at the beginning, Parashon et al. We want to ask if participants with higher versus lower pre-existing perceptual sensitivity are differentially affected by single talker versus multi-talker word learning. So we had a single talker in our word learning experiments. We'd like to expand and see if there's differential effects between single and multi-talker. So the predictions for if we implement that study is that participants with the lower pre-existing sensitivity will benefit more from single talker than from multi-talker, and participants with higher pre-existing sensitivity will benefit more from the multi-talker than the single talker in the word learning exposure. Sure. So thank you. Thank you to the Speech Acquisition Lab, all the members for their encouragement and their feedback. We've practiced this talk a bunch of times. And thank you to Shannon and Rachel for all of their help and support. Also to our Hindi talkers and our study participants. Thank you for your time and your contributions to this research. Okay, yeah, Kelly.
You guys have to exclude a lot of participants, and from what I'm understanding, is that the relationship between experiment 1 and experiment 2, it wasn't like a pre-screening, they completed this study, right? So they weren't screened out and you have their data. You plan to look at their data at any point?
I don't think we currently have plans to look at that data. It's disappointing sort of to exclude that many participants, but yeah, we wanted to make sure that the contrast was novel, so that's why I make all those data.
I had 2 questions. I was curious, I might have missed this part, but how far apart were these experiments conducted?
Oh, right. Yeah, I think it was like 6 months apart-ish. So they had to complete the first one to do the second one, but it had been several months.
And then I was curious about for like the word learning, like how you came up, or I say come up with the vocabulary, but like how did you decide on the specific words they were, you know, like why did you pick a caption or something else? Yeah, like I was curious about if you had like a you know specific,
like the images you mean?
Yeah, and like the specific why like those words. I mean, they have the endings in them, so they were, but like did you create those words? Like how did you like
well, so the images are sort of like a stock set of word learning images from like linguistics studies in general, I believe. And so they're basically just like common objects and things that would be easy to learn. The speech sounds themselves are formulated to be like Hindi, like fake Hindi words that work in Hindi but aren't real words. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and then they just kind of like go with like was there a specific, you know, just like these ones sound like they follow the rules and someone used them, or was there like a specific method you used? I don't know if that's
I don't know what you mean. Like
did you just kind of like did you just form, you know, create these words based off of the rules of the language, or did you like how specific like you need this one to sound like word counts need to sound this way or
they're all 2 syllables, but I'm not sure if there's any other one answer. No, nope. I don't know. Yeah, they're just meant to be mouse words for Hindi. Lex.
So with the 2 different experiments that you were running, I'm assuming there was some variance in the population that you were able to pull for both. I obviously they were connected because you had to do the one through the other. But were people excluded from the second one that weren't excluded from the first one?
Yeah, so that's a weird thing. Yeah, it doesn't make sense why they were. We're kind of trying to figure out what happened there. We're not sure why like things have changed in between, but we did have to exclude additional participants from the same criteria. We're working on that. Yes.
So you mentioned that between both of these things that there was a 6-month delay. Is there any reason why that was 6 months specifically, or did it just happen to do that?
It kind of just happened. It wasn't like we must do it this many months apart. It was they needed to be separate sessions. Well, partly because we were testing, the initial research question of is there actually variability here to study, and it was also just like each one is the length of a full experiment for like the participants, so it made sense to separate them. Yes.
When you were doing experiment one with the discrimination between the towns, you had one pairing that was seemed to have like a much better discriminability rating than other towns.
Oh, I lost my rating.
And I know you said you didn't find any correlation or like estimated correlation between ability generally and their performance, but did you look at those pairings separately to see if the ability to discriminate between those sounds corresponded maybe better with those words that maybe it wasn't a generalized effect, but certain sounds were still.
Oh, I see what you mean. I don't think we ran analyses like that, but that's an interesting question.
And if I'm understanding your question, if you could go back one more slide, because this, are you talking about on this slide or on the?
No, it's even.
Because on the next one.
So the spike, is that what you were kind of thinking of?
When you look at the second sound, there's 3 you see like much better rating for that sound pairing in particular.
And so part of that is because these are 4 talkers, and then we had a 5th talker for like basically just that it's different talkers. So because of that, this is more like an effect of the talker than necessarily of that contrast, is how I've been understanding it. So.
And it's I think it's
not your fault.
I think it's really fascinating too that not only like this also just shows that talker matters when we're thinking about like learning words and learning sounds. So obviously talker 3 for the voiced aspirated dental retroflex contrast, like that one was really clear maybe to participants more so than the other 3 talkers, which don't know why, but it's kind of cool to see that talker does matter when we're looking at things like this.
Yeah, it's important for other like perceptual studies that might rely on like 1 or 2 talkers to notice that there's actually a lot of variability in between them. Zeta.
I just like going off of this. So I know you kind of showed us before like their backgrounds, but did you mention, or maybe I was imagining, did they have was there one specific person that had a different dialect, like specifically, or were they all like similar dialects?
You remember which slide that's on?
I think it was before this. Like a few before.
Yeah. So yeah, we have some different dialects here, as well as different native language backgrounds and additional language backgrounds. So that is another thing that could influence the variability.
I'm sorry, so you didn't check if these words correspond with their outline. For example, you use pillar for chicken, but in some languages, pillar is chicken.
Oh, in terms of, I'm not sure about how, like, if the specific words were real words in some people's, I don't think we looked at that specifically. I would hope that it would be drowned out if there were, if there was only like a couple instances of that. But yeah, that is an interesting thing to watch out for. So. guess we're done. Unless anybody has any more questions? No? All right, I'm leaving the stage then.
Thank you, Ari. All right, next up, we've got Casey with Thai reduplication patterns. Should be good.
That's for you.
Sure.
And then I'm going to turn this on for ourselves. There we go. This is a fact. Feel free to.
I get a stuff.
I mean, it is completely up to you. I'm just going to take you to your slide. Being finicky, because you have to stop sharing to get out of.
I mean, I can just stay up here and use the computer without like.
It is completely up to you. Do what you wish.
I would do. I'm just gonna do that. That's okay.
Yep. I'm just gonna get that up and rolling if that is okay. Maybe. If the Zoom would like to pull up. And there you go.
This clicker already works. Where did you go? Where is the knob? There it is. Okay. Okay, cool. I think we got it working. Okay. Oops. Okay, so yeah, my name is Casey Miller. I'm going to be talking today about a mathematical model of tone in Thai reduplication patterns. Okay, so yeah, reduplication is a pretty complex pattern that exists in many forms across the world's languages. So we have it even in English. I'm sure many of you can think back to a time in elementary school, on the playgrounds. Your friend comes up to you and says, "Hey, do you like that person over there?" You say, "Yeah, they're a nice person." And they say, "No, do you like them?" So many would consider the phrase like to be slang, but it's a legitimate result of a linguistic process. And that's the process we're interested in here. So reduplication, where the meaning is changing. The way we're going to be looking at that process is through computational models. These help us to better understand linguistic structures, and they also allow modern applications to better handle linguistic patterns. And then the models that we're using are called finite state machines. So they're an explicit way to represent processes, and they're used today in both industry and academia. And in the age of neural networks and things like that, which require an absurd amount of data to be trained properly, finite state machines are a nice win for low resource languages, or languages which we don't have we don't have enough data to train a neural network on, which is the majority of the world's languages. So my research falls under the scope of computational linguistics. So we'll be looking at why we should care about computational linguistics, or what the perspective is that it brings. Then we'll take a look at Thai, and then we'll take a look at the intuition behind our reduplication models. So why computational linguistics? This comes from the theory of computation, which says we want to look at problems that can be solved computationally or with a model of computation, and we want to ask what makes some problems more computationally difficult than others. This difficulty or complexity can tell us interesting things, such as the fundamental properties or limitations of a mathematical mapping. So by implication, computational linguistics examines aspects of human languages as a mathematical mapping. In doing this, we're interested in the fundamental properties of natural language patterns, to what extent they vary, and what the limitations on them are. Yeah. So before we take a look at Thai, just to get a better understanding of what I mean by analyzing a natural language pattern as a mathematical mapping, let's take a look at an unrelated example in German. So German has a pretty cross-linguistically common process, word final consonant devoicing. So the intuition is that when we look at the plural column, the bolded consonants, are all voiced when they're not at the end of the word. And in the singular column, when they are at the end of a word, the voiced consonants become devoiced. So if we pull an example out of here, now if I wanted to say what I would need to analyze this as a mathematical mapping, I'd need three things. I would need a domain or the inputs, the codomain or the outputs, and the function, the thing that takes us from the, or the map, the thing that takes us from the domain to the codomain. And if I wanted to summarize this rule or this mapping in English, I could say when I have a voice consonant at the end of a word, I want to devoice it. Okay, so yeah, so we want to classify natural language patterns such as the ones I've already looked at in terms of their computational complexity by using mathematical formalization. This can tell us what we want to know, such as why some structures are more favored than others, why some patterns are harder to learn. And then it also has a practical use in modern applications, such as machine translation. So let's move over to Thai. So Thai is a tonal language, has 5 phonemic tones. And if we're talking about relative pitch, 5 being the highest part of my voice and 1 being the lowest, 3 being about mid-range. They have a mid-tone, so words like ma, where the pitch is staying about 3. They have a low tone that starts just below the mid-tone and goes lower, so ma. Then we have a high tone, starts just above the mid-tone and goes higher, ma. A rising tone that starts near the low tone and rises, ma. And then a falling tone that starts at about 5 and falls, ma. So the words marked with an asterisk here are not actual words in Thai. I'm just using them for demonstrational purposes. And before we look at the reduplication patterns in Thai, we want to look at the typology of reduplication patterns. Generally, we have 2 types, partial reduplication, where only a part of the string is copied. So for example, in Turkish, I'm going to copy the bolded syllable here in kara, meaning black, becoming kapkara, meaning very black. Thai features what's called total reduplication, so we're just going to copy the entire string. So dek. Child becomes dek dek. Children. So let's look at the types of total reduplication in Thai. We have type 1, the type we just looked at. So we're just copying the string and we're not going to change it at all. So the other example, nang, to sit becomes nang nang, to sit continuously. Then we have type 2. Here we're going to change the second copy, or the vowel of the second copy to a, and this indicates some sort of negativity or disinterest from the speaker. So we're going to reduplicate the phrase marked with the hyphen, fang thang, which means to listen to music. The full phrase being kao fang thang tuk wan, he listens to music every day. And then the reduplicated phrase becomes fang plang, and the full phrase being kao fang plang tuk wan. He listens to music every day, but I don't really care. Then we have type 3. This is really similar to type 2. So the meaning is the same, except this time we're going to change the rhyme of the first copy. And so if the rhyme of the final syllable of the base, I should say, is a sonorant. So in this case, the phrase we're reduplicating is marked with a hyphen, kian jok mai, mai. The final syllable of that phrase ends in a sonorant. So we're going to, the rhyme that we're going to change it to is ong, marked in bold there on the bottom. So kao kian jok mai. He writes a letter becomes kao kian jok mong, kian jok mai. He writes a letter, but I don't care what he's writing about. And then let's say we have the final syllable ends in a obstruent. So in this case, it's Mimi sit. So sit ends in is the final syllable of the phrase we're looking at, ends in an obstruent. So this time, instead of ong, we're going to change it to o, marked in bold there. So the first phrase, chan Mimi sit roi. I have no such thing as rights, becomes chan Mimi sit roi. I have no such thing as rights at all. And then this one, if let's say it ends, the final syllable of the base ends in a short vowel followed by a glottal stop, then we're going to change the rhyme of the first copy to o. So o followed by a glottal stop. So the first one, we're reduplicating kati, which means coconut milk. So then it becomes kun chop kati rupao. Do you like coconut milk? And then it becomes kun chop kati rupao. Do you like something like coconut milk? Something like is indicating some sort of negativity towards coconut milk, I guess. And then we have the final type, which is pretty interesting. So we're going to change the tone of the first copy. So if I take a word like suai, meaning pretty, then I get suai suai, meaning really pretty. Interestingly, if the base already has a high tone, then there's actually a sixth tone that's not phonemic, but then the first copy would have an extra high tone, if that was the case. So now let's take a look at how we would model natural language patterns computationally. Like I said, we'll use something called finite state machines. These are a series of states and transitions. So if I only cared about the symbols A and B, I could come up with what's called a finite state transducer. It's a type of finite state machine that looks something like this. So the states are marked with Q, and then the final state being QF, marked with a double circle. It just means that's where we're going to end. The input is on the transition, so the edges or the arrows. The input output. The input's on the left of the colon. The output is on the right of the colon. So this finite state transducer, or FST, will take an input like AAB and output AAC. Just to show it's not like completely useless. It's kind of similar to our German final devoicing example, where we don't really care about changing the input to the output for any consonant except, or for any symbol except for the final one. So here the B to C would be like devoicing essentially. So how it works basically is when we input a string, we're going to wrap it with these word boundary symbols, which aren't super necessary, but it makes it really nice for dealing with more complex processes. And when we read them, we don't care about outputting them. So we're going to output nothing, which is indicated by the lambda. So if we start with AAB, we have our input that we're reading from. We're going to start on state 0. We're going to read the boundary symbol. We're going to go forward to state 1, output lambda or nothing, and move forward. Then here we'll stay on state 1. We'll read an A and output an A. And the same here. And then here we'll read a B, output a C, and go to state 2. And then we'll read the final boundary symbol, output nothing, and then we can end. So the thing to notice here is this is only able to read a string one time. So it's only able to read the input one time. But if we're modeling reduplication, intuitively we can think I want to read the string once, then I want to go back to the beginning and I want to read it again. This type of finite state transducer or finite state machine is not able to do that. So we have to use a more expressive type of finite state machine, which I'll get to in a second. But if we think back to the types of reduplication that we looked at, we had partial reduplication, where I'm only copying a part or a substring. And here I know the upper bound. So in this case, the upper bound is the syllable. I know the maximum length of a syllable. So the part that we're copying, we know the upper bound and it's finite. But in total reduplication, I don't know, I'm copying the entire string and I don't know how long that string could be. It could be any length, and I want my model to be able to handle a string of any length. And for this reason, total reduplication is unbounded, or the length of the input string is unbounded, and that makes it a little bit more computationally complex. So we have to use a two-way finite state machine, two-way finite state transducer, I mean, like I mentioned before. So this time the input-output pair is in the parenthetical expression, and then the final parameter is the direction parameter. It tells us to either go forward or backwards on the input tape. So basically, if we want to take an input word D, meaning good, I'll read the word boundary symbol, I'll output nothing, I'll go forward on the input tape, and I'll go forward to state 1. Here, the sigma just means any character, so I'm going to read a character and output that same character. We'll go forward on the input tape, but I'll stay on state 1. Same thing here. And now when I read this boundary symbol, I'm going to output nothing. I'm going to go forward to state 2, but I'm going to go backwards on the input tape. And now every time I read a symbol, I'm going to output nothing and go backwards, but I'll stay on state 2 until I reach the word boundary symbol. When I read that, then we're going to output the reduplication boundary symbol, go forward to state 3, and now go forwards or left to right on the input. Here we're just going to copy it again, just like we did. And now we can end. So that's how we would get D to DD, good to very good. Well, like I said, Thai is a tonal language, and linguists normally postulate 2 levels to a word. So we have the segmental level for the consonants and the vowels, and we have the autosegmental level, the tones or the processes that act independent of the segment. So in other words, if we wanted to model tone, we would need to separate these 2 levels. Then we would be able to reduplicate each level respectively, and then we could combine the levels into a single output. So the second point here is the 2-way finite state transducer that we just saw. So, or it would be a 2-way finite state transducer, I should say. And then to do the first and the third steps, we actually need a different type of more expressive finite state machine called a multi-tape finite state transducer. So essentially it lets you read from 1 or more inputs and output to 1 or more outputs. So basically what we would use it for, here if we take a word ngai, meaning easy, then we could split it. So we're reading 1 input and outputting to 2 outputs. We want to split the tone from the segment. Then we want to reduplicate each level. And then we want to use a different multi-tape finite state transducer to linearize or combine them. So read from 2 inputs to 1 output. And that's how we would get ngai, meaning very easy. So the split string and the linearized functions are multi-tape finite state transducers, and the reduplicate sections each are a 2-way finite state transducer. So this is basically the intuition behind all of our models. And this composition of expressive finite state machines is one we expanded upon an existing model in the literature. So basically, in conclusion, what we wanted to do was provide an explicit model of a complex linguistic process. Like I said, our model uses several more expressive types of finite state machines. Our model improves the robustness of the literature by showing that with some modification, existing models can handle other types of reduplication in tonal languages without too much change to the complexity of the model. And yeah, just like to say thank you. Thank you to Dr. DeSanto for helping me a lot with this, and to the UCR audience and the Speech Acquisition Lab for helping me practice this. And then also we just heard that the paper that we wrote in connection with this research just got accepted to be published. So if anyone is interested on this or interested about this, then I can send you the paper, I guess. Perfect. All right. Oh yeah, sorry. The model that we did, it's based on Shupaman. It's a Bantu language in Central Africa. If you were doing like a 2-way FST for, are you talking about tonal languages with reduplication or just reduplication in general?
How can you sort of expand beyond just identification?
Well, I'd have to look at the different types of reduplication in other languages. So if like our model differed from the Shupaman model in the sense that we required a 2-way FST on both the tonal level and the segmental level. Theirs only had it for the segmental level because the tonal level was an entirely different process. So yeah, I'd have to look at the other languages reduplication patterns and see if it would fit this. But generally, if it is a pattern similar to Thai, then it would work. You might have to alter the implementation of the model slightly because ours is based on like Thai phonotactics as well. So yeah.
It's like you brought up the duplication and then it changes. It's like in the duplication that kind of part of thing. With the second model, like with the tone, like, is it capable of doing the change in it, or is that like, well, that would, you know, does that make sense? Like if you input the word that has a change, like the partial reduplication, can you get it to change and then output along with reduplication? That really makes sense.
I'm not sure what you mean.
So if you put in just the word that, or the segment that is going to be changed when it's duplicated, still like being partially duplicated, is like incapable of doing that on the double level? Like if the tone is changing, or that maybe just you're right.
Well, ours is specifically for total reduplication. I'm sure you could implement one for partial reduplication if that's what you're asking.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Sorry, I made that way more complicated than it needed to be.
Okay. All right, cool. If no more questions, then thank you very much.
So that brings us to the end of this year's Uuscil. We just want to thank you all for coming, for staying till the end. Thank you to all of our presenters. Can we give them a more round of applause, please?
Then you have all probably seen Ari coming up here to help us with tech. They were very gracious after being voluntold that they were doing tech today. So I would like to give a special shout out to them because Ari had absolutely no obligation to help me and I very much roped him into it. But before we let you go, we want to say thank you very much again for coming, but also as much as this is a way to get involved, you can also get involved in the linguistics department with students, either through the undergraduate club or through the graduate club.
Yep. So LCU and Links are always happy to have more active participants. And we really hope that with so many new faces getting involved this year, we'll see lots of activity in those clubs and organizations in the coming year as well. So thank you all once again. Congratulations to all of our presenters. You did an amazing job. And everyone enjoy the weather. Hopefully it's not snowing still out there.